Welcome to APEC. It's January 30th, and I'm your moderator, Tim Ventura. First, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today on this call, and let's do a big shout out to everyone watching us on the YouTube live stream. I'd also like to thank Mark Sokol and the Falcon Space team, and give a giant thank you to today's scheduled presenters, Bill Alek and David Chester. Bill will be presenting on his research into ZPE and anti-gravity, and David will be discussing engineering approaches and applications to quantum gravity. After that, Mark will be showcasing progress on his latest projects, and if we have time, we may do a request for ad hoc presentations as well. So I have a couple of quick announcements. Our new website is almost ready. You can check that out at www.altpropulsion.com. Again, that's www.altpropulsion.com. We're continuing to post conference events on the American Anti-Gravity and Alien Scientist channels and websites. And just Google those, you can find them easily. You can view our full conference events at either one of those. Please save your questions during the conference for the Q&A session after each presentation. You can raise your hand or ask a question in chat. We'll go through them after each presenter finishes. And that was just about it. So thank you again for joining us. And let's welcome Bill Alek as our first presenter. And I'm going to spotlight Bill right now. There we go.
Okay, I think we're on. Okay, Tim, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to this conference here. And we're going to get into a lot of detail concerning free energy and how I'm connecting it with anti-gravity as well. So this is going to be an in-depth presentation, a lot of detail. So let's get started here. So let's share the screen. Okay. Can you all see the screen?
Yeah, it looks great.
Oh, okay. Very good. Okay. Connecting free energy and anti-gravity. Let's go to the next slide here. Oops. Okay. You know, a few weeks ago, Mark, you know, you had Mark as a guest here at Cancellation, and he gave some details on the ARV, and I thought I'd give you my view on this technology, the Alien Replica Vehicle, ARV Flux Liner. Now, when I first looked at this several years ago, when I'm looking at, you know, what I'm looking at here, I didn't really see anything that caught my eye. You know, what's the anti-gravitational component here? And so Mark did all these illustrations for an aerospace company. And I believe it was back in the mid-1980s. And I noticed that, you know, looking at these illustrations here, you see these tanks. The center column, of course, has your Tesla coil. When I saw this aluminum flywheel, you know, at the base of this unit here, I immediately thought of, well, it gives it stabilization, okay, in flight. That you're going to have propulsion here, but there's no way to keep the craft stable in flight unless you have something rotating in here. And that, of course, is this flywheel device. So my interpretation of this is that it's basically a gyroscope to keep the craft stable. And then, of course, it's powered with hydrogen and oxygen fuel cell arrangement. So before a flight, they would fuel this craft up with most likely hydrogen and oxygen, and run this craft using fuel cell technology, which was quite common in the space industry here. So let's go to the next slide. And here's Mark, contracted by Lockheed. Okay, and then Mark presented this illustration here showing 3 versions of the craft. And of course, I'm going to focus on the smaller version here. But the 3 versions, 3 various sizes of the craft were built. I assume this was built, these craft were built back in the 70s, maybe late 60s, early 70s. Now, in this illustration, something very interesting was added in. And of course, the center column here used a Tesla coil. And then at the base, we show a capacitor arrangement. So we're going to be using very high voltage to generate very high voltage using the Tesla coil. And it's going to produce an electromagnetic flux on the outside of this craft. And it loops, the flux is going to come out the top, which is going to be what I generally read as the electrode of the capacitor, okay, which is, you have these capacitor plates at the base of the craft, and that's one electrode. And then the other electrodes are going to be at the top or near the top of this flux liner. And so the flux is, electromagnetic flux is going to come out and then wrap around the outside of this craft. Now I noticed some illustrations done many years ago in relating to the German Haunebu craft. And they always referred to this flux as a Geist field, okay? And of course, Geist translates in German, in English to like a ghost or a spirit field. And that of course was on the outside of this craft. So what you're looking at here is a very high frequency oscillator, electromagnetic oscillator, that is somehow interacting with gravity. And then with this illustration here, Mark mentioned that this coil arrangement above the base of the craft here, that they use mercury, okay, or a mercury vapor, and coils of it here, where one side is connected to one electrode at the base of this craft, and then the other one is connected, would be connected to the Tesla coil at the base of the Tesla coil. And then this mercury is the whole key to the operation of this device. Okay, this is what gives you the anti-gravitational component. Okay, so the next slide right here. So why mercury? Well, it turns out that this experiment was done and posted at Stephen Hartman's overunity.com website. And I just happened to catch it one day and downloaded the image. And this experimenter was using a fluorescent tube. And the way that it's wired in this configuration here is that the transformer was operating in a flyback mode, low frequency operation, and would energize this tube. Now, of course, inside fluorescent tubes is of course a mercury or a mercury vapor, okay? So immediately I thought that, okay, well, we're connecting an experiment here in free energy utilizing mercury, and how this correlates to the mercury being used in the ARV. So what's going on here with mercury? Well, we get this, if you look this up in Wikipedia with mercury, you get something that they call an avalanche effect. And this avalanche effect is is essentially what we would call, in quantum mechanics here, negative resistance. And so with this avalanche effect occurring here, you would get excess energy, okay, from this technology. But it's not just ordinary energy. This is negative energy is what we're working with here. That's the whole key to this, to get negative energy to couple in producing this anti-gravitational effect. So what you're seeing here is basically a system for harnessing free energy using this negative resistance effect that's found in mercury vapor. And I think this directly correlates to the technology used in the ARV. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, so what is this avalanche effect? Well, I'm calling it, it's a quantum tunneling effect, or creates a quantum tunneling effect. And what's actually going on with the electrons is that there's a mass reduction effect, okay, to create this negative energy. And the field that this negative energy produce is what the Germans with the Haunebu craft called their Geist field, okay? And that's what the flux around the craft would form, is this Geist field effect. Okay, so what is this quantum tunneling effect? Well, we see here in this illustration, in classical physics, we're pulling, let's say, an electron up the hill. That's your electric force. But then with quantum tunneling, there's an extra force applied to this electron to get it to what we call quantum tunneling. And that quantum tunneling is the mass reduction effect, or reducing the mass of these electrons by twisting them or applying a torsion field effect to that electron and getting it to quantum tunnel. Okay, so what we're doing is applying another force to this electron to get it to curl into the Dirac sea of negative energy. And this is done by changing the phase angle of the electron. And this is what I'm calling the quantum tunneling effect. And so what is this negative energy, and how do we store it in coils, for example? Well, when we look at equation 1, that's your typical equation for calculating the energy in that B field, okay, the magnetic field around a coil. We're passing through a coil. Equation 2 is a complex version of that B field. And that's what we do when we apply our torsion field effect. We cause that electron to rotate essentially into another space. And that space is what we call the complex field, okay? Now, when you square the complex magnetic field is where you get negative energy. That's your negative energy solution. So the square of the complex field is negative energy, because the square root of a -1 is -1. That's your negative energy. And so a number of years ago, I used this formula here that's called Euler's formula. And that's really is dictating the rotation of this spin axis of these electrons to get this torsion field effect. And that's what allows the electron to rotate from our positive energy universe into this negative energy universe to 180 degrees out of phase with our universe. So this negative energy universe, which is really from the future, we're looking at that as future energy, is accessible using Euler's formula applied to the B field. and causing that B field to rotate into this complex field. Now the complex field, which is really the Geist field, okay? And that's what these craft are using to create this negative energy effect, is that the complex field is at 90 degrees out of phase with our universe. And the negative energy that's being utilized here is 180 degrees, which is the square of the complex field, okay, to give you the negative energy, which is 180 degrees out of phase, giving you the negative energy component here. Okay, so that's the negative energy that would be stored in a coil just by changing the phase of the electron. Okay, so what we end up with is with torsion, and we can apply this to mass. And this is what gives you the effect of a reduced mass, because that electron is rotating. Okay, it's rotating from our space into another space. So when you hook up instrumentation and try to measure what this electron's doing, what you're going to see is a mass reduction. And that's because the mass is now beginning to manifest out of our universe into this negative energy universe. Okay, that's 180 degrees out of phase. And so just by applying Euler's formula to the mass of the electron, okay, times gamma is what gives you the energy of that electron. And that electron energy can be either positive or negative, depending upon what the phase of that electron is at. So this shows how it manifests between dimensions of our real 3D space, and that at 90 degrees from our universe, we have the imaginary 3D space, that's where your Geist field of the magnetic component here manifests. And then the negative mass of that electron will then manifest 180 degrees out of phase with our universe here. That's the negative energy universe. Now you also know on this diagram that Einstein's general relativity theory can only manifest in real 3D space using only a half a dimension of time. In other words, the time forward component. But the time reversal component can only manifest in this negative real 3D space. Okay, so if you wanted a complete model of Einstein's general theory of relativity, you would have to incorporate it as this negative 3D space, and with a full dimension of time, where time can run forward and reverse. And when it runs in reverse, it's in the negative energy universe. Okay, so the next slide, demonstration. So what I'm going to do right now is switch off sharing and then go to a little demo here of what I'm talking about. Okay, here we are. Okay, now the 3D space that I'm talking about here is that when you look at a coordinate system, you have X, Y, and Z, okay? Now what we're saying here, when we look at the energy, let's say the positive energy universe would manifest, let's say this vertical dimension here. So you have 3 dimensions here, 3 dimensions here, and then 3 dimensions here. And you notice in the imaginary plane here, we're 90 degrees out of phase, so that the imaginary universe is now 90 degrees out of phase. And then the negative energy universe would be 180 degrees out of phase there. And it's entirely accessible through the electron, just by changing that phase angle. And so that's what this technology is doing here, is that when we look at positive energy manifesting here, when we apply torsion to the electron, causes the electron to rotate just by using torsion into the imaginary plane and then start to manifest into the universe that's 180 degrees out of phase with ours as negative energy, okay? Just by applying torsion to the electron. So that's the depth of that. Let's go back to the, okay, share screen. Okay, now we also see this phenomena occurring with tunnel diodes. And with tunnel diodes, when you start to increase the voltage across the tunnel diode, you see the behavior of the electric current changes. And so from 0 to V1, you see a positive energy. Now, what's very interesting about this is that quantum mechanics, they do not want to touch negative energy. It's just off limits to them. So what they did is kind of like a bait and switch here. He said, rather than discuss negative energy, they're going to call this negative resistance. And so that's what we saw with the fluorescent tube in Mercury, is that the negative resistance effect is really a distraction, okay, to get you to look here, but not over here. The not over here is the negative energy, which is really what's occurring in these circuits. And so what we see here is that from V1 to V2 is what they call this negative resistance region. It's really negative energy that is occurring here. And so what we see in this negative energy region is that the flow electron greatly increases rather than in the positive region. Let's see, positive energy region from V2 up to the breakdown voltage of the diode, that would be the positive energy region. This negative energy region, the flow of electrons greatly increases. And that's the phenomena that's occurring, the same phenomena occurring, okay, with Mercury in these fluorescent tubes. And I would say it's the same phenomena occurring in these ARVs as well, okay? So we had this region of negative energy. And all it is another force acting on the electron to create this quantum tunneling effect. And it greatly speeds up the electron flow. See, one of the problems when you deal with tunnel diodes, and I did some work on them back in the 1980s, you really can't get them anymore here in the US. The parts that I have were made in Russia. So you'd have to order these diodes from Russia. But what they have is that if you don't design the circuit correctly, there's a parasitic oscillation that occurs in these diodes at very high frequencies. And that's due to this quantum tunneling effect of negative energy, causes it to oscillate or self-oscillate at ultra high frequencies. And so you actually see the speeding up of the electron flow in the circuits. And so that's the negative energy effect, is a speeding up of electron flow in that negative energy region. Okay, so what I did is I'm kind of a student of Don Hodson, and you'll see his papers were published in Infinite Energy magazine almost 20 years ago. And they are available on academia.edu is where I have his paper posted. And Don Hudson, his take on all this is that there's really only one stable particle in the universe, and that's the electron. And so the charge on the electron can either be positive or negative. And so in this case, we would have a time forward positive mass electron as E negative, but then the counterpart of that, which was successfully predicted by Paul Dirac back in the 1920s, was of course the positron. And the charge on the positron has a positive charge, which is the time reversed. That's the time reversed charge of a time forward charge that we have in our universe. But you can still have a positive mass positron, okay? But the charge is time reversed. So now what I did is, I'm taking a somewhat of a practical approach to this, which is what Don Hudson did in a lot of his work. I calculated what the moment of inertia is. Now, you really can't find this anywhere that I know of on the internet here. Or you can't find a correct equation for the moment of inertia for that electron anywhere. So what I did is I had to back calculate what that moment of inertia is. And it turns out to be the moment of inertia equals 2 times the mass of the electron times the radius squared, which is very interesting. The reason why you don't find this anywhere is that when you go and calculate what the rotational speed is at the radius of that electron, it's something like 26 times the speed of light. And so when they discovered this back in the 1920s or so, they basically threw up their hands and said, this is absurd, this can't be. Nothing can be faster than the speed of light, okay? This thing cannot be rotating at that speed. So they basically threw it away. They threw this away. So what I did is that I decided, well, let's keep this. Maybe this is really what's happening here. So that when I go and figure out all my calculations, they all fall in place. It's a valid calculation when you go and compute with the mass of the electron based on this moment of inertia. Now, what's interesting about this thing is that we also have this virtual particle flux that exists in the vacuum. And we have 2 versions of it. And so the standard model says that we have electron and positron pairs, that they manifest through a creation event. They manifest as separate electron and positrons. And we see that in accelerators. But what we're saying here is that there is no such thing as annihilation and creation events, that these electron and positron pairs exist in the vacuum, and they're everywhere. Okay, they manifest as what we would call the ether. And so the electron-positron pairs, they don't annihilate and they don't create. They exist in the vacuum. And so they have this property, when you go and take a closer look concerning how they rotate, is that you get a mass cancellation effect that occurs. And that mass cancellation effect is the counter-rotating component of the electron-positron pair. And the same phenomena occurs with Cooper pairs as well. That Cooper pairs has a counter-rotating component that cancels out the mass of this of these pairs. And then another demo just to show you this. I can do another demo here. Okay, so what I have are two types of gyroscopes. Just a regular gyroscope here, and then a gyroscope where I counter rotate these. They're epoxied together. And anyone can do this experiment. And so when we run up one, you get something called rotational inertia with this. So if you try to change the spin axis of this, you feel that there's a resistive force. And so what we're saying, there's an analog to this in regards to the mass of the electron, that this actually creates the mass of the electron, okay? The mass of the electron would be defined as a spinning vortex of an electromagnetic plenum that creates the electron. Now, when we come along and we counter rotate these electrons, for example, in a Cooper pair or in a virtual particle flux, we get something that very interesting what happens here. Okay, so we start these two up. And so what we see is that it cancels out the rotational inertia, okay, of this spinning gyroscope. And that's what we see with the virtual particle flux, is a cancellation of the mass effect using counter-rotating systems. And so if we go back to our presentation here. Yeah, so we have these two different particles that have been identified, electron-positron pairs and Cooper pairs. And that's where we see this mass cancellation effect occurring. Okay, next slide. Scalar energy.
Bill, let me jump in really quick. It looks like your screen share isn't up yet. You might
Oh,
wanna, yeah.
I didn't, okay.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay, so if we go from here, this slide here shows the two virtual particles here, identified as Cooper pairs and electron-positron pairs. Both have a mass canceling effect. Both are counter-rotating. But you'll notice that the electron-positron pair has a net charge. And here we see with the Cooper pair is that there's a charge cancellation effect. That's the difference between the two. But they're both counter-rotating. So we cancel out the mass effect. Okay, so scalar energy. Okay, based on this calculation, when I derive this equation for the moment of inertia of the electron, I'm really tying the mass of the electron to its spin, okay, to its rotation. And that, of course, is given by this top equation up here. And so when I did the math on all this, see, all the math still works. All the math works. And you're able to find what the self-energy, or what I call what really the Higgs field is this plenum that makes up or creates the electron. And of course, shown on the left here is that this field that surrounds the electron is the Higgs field. And that's what gives the mass effect. It's like a spinning, I can describe it as a spinning vortex. And at the radius of that electron, it's spinning something like 26 times the speed of light, but that speed rapidly falls off. And that at a critical distance from that electron is where the speed of light is derived from. So the speed of light is actually the interaction between the electron and the electron-positron pairs that form in a vacuum. And as electron-positron pairs would surround the electron. But at this critical distance from the electron is where you have the origin of the speed of light. Now, nothing can exist inside the electron because we know what the field equations are of this field surrounding the electron is the square of the radius. So you can't have anything on the inside of the electron. It has to be completely empty. If there was something on the inside of that electron, because of course physicists want to take particles and they want to fill them with something to give them mass, but that's not the origin of mass. Mass is on the outside of the electron along with the charge of the electron. It's all on the outside of that electron. If you had anything on the inside, it would collapse to a singularity, okay? If you had anything on the inside of that electron, it would collapse to a singularity just by the equations. The equations tell you that there can't be anything on the inside. So it has to be a hollow sphere, okay? All electrons, all particles have to be hollow spheres like this. Otherwise, they would collapse in on themselves just by the equation that tells you that it would. Okay, so next slide here. Okay, back around 2016, I was exhibiting at the Extraordinary Technology Conference in Albuquerque, and this fellow by the name of Bob Boyce approached me. And he was looking at some of my anti-gravitational research in this field. And he mentioned he was a tech hired into Area 51 as a problem solver back in the 1970s. It's like, okay, that sounds interesting. And his job was to fix a problem with these ARVs. And the problem is that you would get inconsistencies in the field, what I spoke about before, the Geist field surrounding these ARV craft. And he referred to this uneven field as creating this effect that's called inertia leakage. And he says it was killing the pilots on these ARVs. Because when they would do the rapid acceleration, when you didn't have a constant or a consistent field, you may have had holes in the field. It would create this inertia leakage effect. And this would ultimately kill the pilots. So his job was to come in and fix this problem with these ARVs. And so, I can't prove that he actually worked there or this is a true story, but it seemed quite reasonable to me what he was talking about with this inertia leakage problem. That if you don't have a consistent field around these craft that allows inertia to leak into the craft and of course cause catastrophic effects with anything that's biological within these craft, okay? So his job was to fix that. Okay, what I want to touch on today is something that I'm currently working on, and they're called Pcm Resonators. And so, well, what's a Pcm resonator? Well, it's an acronym for a phase conjugate mirror, okay? And back in December 31st, 2020, just about a month ago, I filed a patent. And you're looking at a picture of what's in the patent, okay? And what's in it is our SFT, the split flux transformer, hooked up to a capacitor. And of course, that forms a phase conjugate mirror resonator. Now, what I discovered was that it has to be in this configuration, because what you have is the split flux transformer with these two converging output coils. Okay, they're wired in a converging mode where the inductance subtracts rather than add. Okay, and so when it subtracts like this, and when you hook it up to a capacitor, it resonates at a specific frequency. And it turns out that this is the true free energy effect. If you're looking for free energy, this is the way to do it. Setting up a PCM resonator. Now, who spoke about this? Well, it was Tom Bearden back in the 1990s. He spoke about this in a lot of his lectures. And I happened to catch one back in 1997 where he presented a lecture on free energy and anti-gravity systems using these PCM resonators. Okay, so next slide. Examples of PCM resonators. Well, it turns out Nikola Tesla's magnifying transmitter was a PCM resonator. When you closely examine the diagram that Nikola Tesla provided, you'll discover that it is a PCM resonator. Another example would be the Floyd Sweet device with this opposing coils and his ferrite magnet configuration was a PCM resonator. Another example would be the Stanley Meyer water cart. He also used these coils wired in an opposing configuration connected to a water capacitor. Then, of course, another example is the split flux transformer that I'm currently using. And you also find the same phenomena occurring in metamaterials. Metamaterials are also resonators as well. And there's certain resonating points that you find in the material itself where you have large negative energy points, okay, points of resonance. And to get this phenomena to work correctly, it has to be in this resonant mode. And if we go back to the ARV that I presented at the beginning of this lecture, that's a resonant system, okay, with the Tesla coil, the capacitors at the base, producing this flux, and that flux is rotated, okay, into this imaginary dimension that we call a Geist field. And so that's what we're working with here. These are all examples of PCM resonators. And of course, Tom was, there's a video out there, a YouTube video that explains this beautifully, okay, what's going on with these PCM resonators. And it's a lecture given by Tom Bearden. I think it was back in the 1990s at a psychotronics conference. Okay, so what's going on with these PCM resonators? Well, what you have is this configuration of pump waves, wave 1 and wave 2, acting on what Tom would call a nonlinear medium. Well, it turns out that the nonlinear medium could be just the vacuum itself. It's like you don't need any material there to get this phenomena to work. It's just that in the split flux transformer, for example, I'm using a met glass material, okay, as a nonlinear material here. So you get this converging wave pattern acting on this material, wave 1 and wave 2. And then you input into this PCM system a time forward signal wave, W3, and you get back a reflected component of wave 4 of what you put in. Now, ideally, this reflected component would completely cancel wave 3. So you could be inputting energy into this system and getting negative energy coming back. Now, this is negative energy, okay? Wave 4 is what we call a phase conjugate replica transverse wave of the input signal, okay? That's what we get reflected back. Okay, so what are these devices doing? Now, typically we're all familiar with this top schematic, this typical device, where you input power. Let's say you input a kilowatt, you output maybe a little less than a kilowatt into a load, and then you dissipate some heat. Well, the same phenomena occurs with the PCM resonator as well. But the difference between the two is that you have this reflected component due to this pumping action that you have of negative energy returning back to the supply. So really, we're building a typical device, okay? But the difference between the two is that we have this input side that has this reflected negative energy component. And this negative energy component is shown in this diagram here, showing the PCM wave function, is that the time forward input, shown as a solid wave, the dotted wave is the reactive time reversed EM wave due to that pumping action back to your source. So that when you add the energy of those two waves, you could be inputting, let's say, a milliwatt, but yet, I mean, you're still supplying a kilowatt input, but the time reflected component could be 999 watts of power being reflected back as negative energy, but you're still driving a kilowatt load with this, okay? This is what's so amazing about this technology, is that we get this reflected, time reversed output that's coming from this device along the input side of this device. And the two equations they add. So again, you know, I want to say that you can have a milliwatt coming in and a kilowatt out, and that's what you would actually read on your meters. All our meters would read that. A milliwatt in and a kilowatt out. Okay, now I want to touch on what Tom Bearden was talking about here. Because if you use the Heaviside equations of the Maxwell equations, everything's moving at the speed of light. So the problem is that you can't really equate something that's moving at the speed of light to general relativity, because general relativity is talking about something that is stationary, okay? And this is what Tom Bearden was emphasizing, is that if you use a standard vector solution like you have in the Heaviside Maxwell equations, when you do this operation, and this is the pumping action, okay, we're doing with if we apply our two vectors of pump waves, that when you take the cross product, okay, of these pump waves, you get a zero vector and nothing else. And this is why Heaviside electrodynamics or Maxwell equations would be incomplete. Okay, you cannot get anything gravitational out of it or anti-gravitational. It really can't explain what these devices are doing adequately. So what Tom says is that you have to go back earlier and use quaternion math to solve this problem, okay? And so this is how he did it. And Tom Bearden, he covers this in his video lecture quite well. He does a pretty good job with it. So we describe as one of these vectors, Q, and we represent it as a quaternion representation. And then when you take the cross product of that same vector, you still get the zero vector solution you would have in your ordinary Heaviside equation. You still get this zero vector, but then you have this other scalar component. And this is what Tom was emphasizing here, is that you get the full gravitational equation here using quaternion math to solve this problem. So that when we go and simplify this cross product of this pumping action, we see that we have a squared plus the zero vector. And so that when we apply a sine wave, for example, okay, to our device, we apply, it could be any frequency here. When we apply our sine wave equation, sine of omega t, and set this all equal to Q, we discover that when we take the cross product of this, we see the internal structure of the zero vector. And that's how Tom Bearden describes what the zero vector is really doing. And he calls it a vacuum engine. And that inside the zero vector is that you have the scalar wave function of a squared times sine squared omega t. And so Tom says, well, this is your scalar wave right here, which is a local gravitational wave. So you can only solve this problem using quaternion math of finding out what the zero vector really contains, and that you really have this, this function, this scalar wave, and it's a pumping action on whatever media you're acting on here, okay? And that pumping action, when you hit it with the wave that comes into this nonlinear material, let's go back up to here. Right here with wave 3, you then get this transverse wave here that comes out. Okay, that's time reversed. It's negative energy that appears on the same circuit. Okay, that's producing this pumping action here. And it turns out that this is where you get the milliwatt coming in and the milliwatt the kilowatt coming out. The milliwatt is the addition of that transverse time reversed wave function, okay? So that's how that works. Okay, so just to reiterate here, the scalar wave and this Tom Bearden scalar wave theory is really this pump wave action producing a local gravitational wave that's being manifest here. Okay, so PCM resonators. Ran the test on this. This is actual data, and this would be as if you hooked up actual meters reading the RMS values of the input and output, we see that we have, with a frequency of 200 hertz, into the split flux transformer, into, I think that's 10 microfarads or so capacitor. We're just measuring voltages and currents. That's all that we're doing here. With a frequency of 200 hertz, I'm using the scope here, the 2024B, which is an excellent scope, by the way. You know, I highly recommend. These are isolated channel scope, and they work extremely well. And so the voltage, RMS voltage, 6.87 volts coming in, 0.22 amps. Output voltage, 21.31 volts RMS, with an output current of 0.27 amps. So we're seeing input power of 1.44 volt amps, output power of 5.78 volt amps. So we have a multiplication gain of about 3.76. So again, this PCM resonator here, it's reflecting back, if you were to take the power difference here, this is the power that's being reflected back of, and given us this power gain of 3.76. So this is exactly what we're talking about here. You know, like the Floyd Sweet device, for example, you had a milliwatt coming in, a kilowatt coming out. You know, you had a phenomenal power gain, and that's due to how well these output coils are balanced, okay? So you want to get the inductance of these output coils to balance. If you want them to balance perfectly, the inductance would have to be near zero, okay? When you go and try and measure the output inductance of these two coils. Even though individually they read about maybe 30 millihenries, when they're wired up in this configuration of a PCM resonator, they subtract rather than add. And when they subtract, you want to get that number close to zero as possible, okay? And so that would increase the power multiplier of these devices quite high. And of course, Floyd Sweet had his device tuned to, I think about 1 million or 10 million to 1. Okay, so you can end up with phenomenal power gains here. Okay, next slide. Back around 2005, I wrote a paper. It's published over there in academia.edu is where I have this paper. It's Newtonian torsion physics. And this is how I ended up using rotation of those electrons in torsion, okay, to rotate from our universe, positive energy, into a negative energy universe. The torsion is in this paper, and it's over there at academia.edu. And there's a lot of interesting information that I presented in this paper as well. I talk about new properties of the electron governed by inverse square laws, a classical solution to quantum tunneling. The Biot-Savart law embodies special relativity. Believe it or not, the Biot-Savart law was written back in the 1830s, and it embodies special relativity. It's built into that equation. Just by changing the phase angle of the electron, we call that torsion, creates the quantum tunneling effect. And of course, the outside of the electron is, of course, what I call the Higgs field. Okay, so I came up with, applying torsion, and you can apply torsion to various components that we find in equations here. And all it is Euler's formula, okay, applied to the moment of inertia, angular momentum, the energy, the mass of the electron. So that's done in this slide here. The standard model of physics is destroyed. This Russian fellow wrote this paper, and he shows that all particles in the accelerators that are known can be replaced with fast-moving electrons and protons, which are stable fundamental particles. So he's saying all the artifacts that were discovered in these particle accelerators can be explained as electrons and protons. And of course, in Don Hodgson's universe, there's really only one fundamental particle in the universe. The rest are just manifestations of the virtual particle flux and electrons, with positrons being the time reverse charge of the electron. And that is my presentation. That's what I presented today. And so there's our website. I'm with ISA Industries, and that is my presentation for today. So I want to thank Tim for giving me this opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, Bill, before anything else, let me thank you. That was an amazing presentation. Absolutely amazing.
Well, it's real. What can I say?
Yeah, well, it was wonderful to see such an in-depth run through on things, and
Right.
and being able to connect all of those dots. So before we do anything else, I am not going to unmute everybody, but let me put it on gallery view, and let's all give Bill an enormous applause.